Greetings everyone, and welcome to part 2 of my Dead Space Disambiguation videos. Well, last time we took a look at the original Dead Space and all the related tie-ins and what order you should watch them and read them and play them in and all that good stuff. Today we're going to take a look at the epic sequel, Dead Space 2. Man, this one absolutely holds the record for the most tie-ins, so we're going to get right into it. Dead Space 2, The Disambiguation, today on the Multimedia Chronicles. Welcome back. Okay, well, we got a lot to go through, so let's get right into it. The first thing we got that tied into Dead Space 2 was the very first Dead Space novel, Dead Space Martyr. Now, Dead Space Martyr takes place about 200 years prior to the events of the first game, and this answers some long-standing questions about the whole backstory. Specifically, Dead Space Martyr is the story of Michael Altman. Yes, the man behind Unitology. Or is he? And, most importantly, it's the story of the discovery of the Black Marker. Yes, the original marker. The actual alien artifact marker that was discovered just off the Yucatan Peninsula. And all the events that surrounded the original necromorph outbreak and the original attempts to study and understand the marker, the foundations of Unitology and where that all came from, and all the various conspiracies and backstabbing and double crosses and triple crosses along the way. It is just an epic, epic story, and it answers a lot of questions as well as poses some more questions about the Dead Space lore, and it is absolutely, I think, an essential chapter. You absolutely need to read this book because it really does shed a lot of light on many of the mysteries of the series and gives you a lot more insight into the backstory that you don't get in the main story. So it really is just a fantastic addition to the overall lore, and I cannot possibly recommend it highly enough. Now, next up, after that, we have the second graphic novel. Now, this time, they did not have Ben Templesmith doing the artwork, but we did have Anthony Johnston returning as writer. We have Dead Space Salvage, and this time we actually have artwork by Christopher Shy, who seems to have become the de facto go-to guy for Dead Space art. He actually did the cover for Martyr, and he actually does the cover and all the interior art for Salvage as well. Now, honestly, I found Salvage kind of so-so. It didn't grab me as much as the original Dead Space graphic novel. I mean, the artwork is quite gorgeous, there's no question about that. But the problem I have with it is Christopher Shy, I find his art style is better suited to just single pieces like covers and things like that, and posters maybe. But I find his art style in being used in a narrative form like this just doesn't work as well. He doesn't seem to be able to diversify his style enough to be able to sort of tell a coherent narrative. So anyway, Salvage is the story of basically a deep space salvage team that discovers the Ishimura after the events of Aegis 7 as detailed in the first game. So this is what happened with the Ishimura after the events of the original Dead Space, and sort of where it went from there and stuff like that. Some would argue a fairly important piece of Dead Space lore, but honestly, I don't know that it is, because by the end of it, you're kind of left feeling like you haven't really been given a very significant piece of the story, and that you can kind of take it or leave it. I would recommend checking it out, if only for the art style and the sort of mood of it. But again, I found that Christopher Shy's art style mixed with the storytelling style of Anthony Johnston just didn't really work as well, and it was actually hard to follow the action sometimes. Like you could tell there was like a necromorph attack going on, but you couldn't quite tell who was getting attacked and what was going on and who was shooting who and who was talking half the time, because a lot of the characters didn't look a lot different, and it was very confusing. So not one of the better chapters of the overall story, but if you're a completist, definitely worth checking out at least once. Now, after that, we had another rather unusual sequel. Specifically, we had a Dead Space game for portable devices, specifically for iOS and then later for Android. So yes, a Dead Space game you could play on your phone. I have never played this one, as I do not have an Android device or an iOS device. So yeah, sadly, it's a piece of the Dead Space saga that I have not experienced. But my understanding is it follows a female protagonist this time, who goes by the nickname of Vandal, and takes place on some of the same locations that Dead Space 2 does. And it does occur before the events in the main game. So yeah, I think it was originally exclusively for iOS, and then it has since become available for Android as well. And I don't think the game itself is that expensive either. I think it's only like $5 or $10. So if you have a portable device and want to check out another chapter of the Dead Space saga, check that one out as well, because it is a part of the main continuity. In fact, Dead Space 2, you find an audio log or two that's actually from the main character of the portable Dead Space game. So kind of interesting. And it is a third-person action game, much like the main games, just with slightly, scaled down graphics for portable devices. So next up, after that, we have Dead Space Aftermath. Yes, the second animated film. Now this one is kind of a strange animal, because it's done kind of in the style of things like The Animatrix or Heavy Metal, where it's a variety of different art styles done by a variety of different directors. They are all tied together with a sort of central story that bridges them all, and it's kind of done as a point of view sort of thing. There was some... again, this actually takes place, I guess, around the same time as Salvage, where Salvage tells us what happened to the Ishimura after the first game. Dead Space Aftermath tells us what happened to Aegis 7 after the events of the first game. Now, for all intents and purposes, we just kind of assumed that Aegis 7 had been destroyed, but apparently not, at least not fully, and it was in the process of breaking up and being destroyed. So Aftermath details the efforts of this crew sent in to hold the planet together using gravity nets just long enough that they can go on the planet and find any remaining pieces of the red marker, because they want to retrieve it so they can continue studying it. And yeah, needless to say, all hell breaks loose. So then what you have is that story told interspersed with the personal experiences of some of the individual members of the crew who encountered the marker in one form or another. And they're being interrogated as to what really happened, and you're sort of given flashbacks of their individual experiences. And the thing I really like about Aftermath is it actually ties pretty strongly into the events of Dead Space 2. In fact, again, much like the original Downfall movie, Dead Space Aftermath leads almost directly into the beginning of Dead Space 2. So you'll see a lot of the same characters played by the same voice actors appear in Aftermath, who also appear in Dead Space 2, and some of them are quite major characters too. So it's really cool to get an introduction to them and get their backstory in the movie prior to going into the main game. So then next up we have another unusual sequel. This time we've got well, a lot of people were hoping that they would do a motion comic of the new graphic novel, but sadly they didn't this time. Instead, we got a completely different motion comic done in a completely different way. And this time it was actually done as an interactive motion comic called Dead Space Ignition. Now, not only is it a motion comic that's interactive, but the actual game part of it is done kind of as a puzzle game. So there's all these different puzzles, this sort of hacking puzzles. Like you play this computer hacker character, and a lot of it involves computer hacking in one form or another in the form of these mini games. So depending what you do in the mini games and what path you choose in the story, you can actually end up with one of, I think, about 4 different outcomes to the story, taken along 4 different paths. So here's the problem. Because there's multiple paths you can take through the story, which shed completely different light on the characters, depending which... I mean, in some versions of the story, the main character turns out to be a bad guy. In other versions, he turns out to be a good guy. And then others, like his friend, is a bad guy or a good guy. And it gets really confusing because there's so many different ways you can go through the story. By the end of it, you're left wondering, kind of scratching your head, like, okay, where does this fall into the continuity exactly? And does it? And if so, is there one sort of optimal path that is considered the official path? Because they all lead to the end, but different versions of events leading it. It's very confusing. And honestly, the game itself, the mini games, while they were kind of okay, I guess, weren't really that good. And the motion comic itself was nowhere near on par with the original motion comic of the first one. It seemed like kind of just a quick cash grab rush job. But on the plus side, it was only $5, so I wasn't really complaining that much. So then finally, after what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things, after 5 tie-ins that take place between the first and second games, we finally get to Dead Space 2, the main game. Now, to further add confusion about Ignition, the opening scene of Dead Space 2 features an appearance by the main character from Ignition. So, okay, does that mean Ignition does fall into the continuity then? And if so, I'm still confused. What's the official storyline? Like, why did they do that? Everything else ties in so beautifully. I don't understand why they went all cryptic with Ignition. Anyway, Dead Space 2, finally, we're there. It's awesome. But it doesn't end there, because one last piece of Dead Space 2, they had Dead Space 2 Severed, which was a downloadable chapter, which gives you, well, 2 chapters, basically, a downloadable mini-game. It doesn't take very long. It takes maybe 2 or 3 hours to play through your first time. But the interesting thing about it is Dead Space Severed is actually a sequel to Extraction. Yes, the prequel game that ties into the first one. So Extraction finally answers some questions about what the fates were of the main characters who survived that one. And yeah, so it's kind of nice to see some of them again. Now in terms of the timeline, Dead Space 2 Severed occurs mostly before the events of Dead Space 2, and then parallel to some of the other events, so it kind of overlaps a little bit. So, to sum up, you start off with Dead Space Martyr. Then you have Dead Space Salvage. So I got my notes here. We'll just not hide them anymore. Then you have the Dead Space iOS Android game. Then you've got Dead Space Aftermath, Dead Space Ignition, Dead Space 2, and then Dead Space 2 Severed. And that will give you the entire complete 100% Dead Space 2 story. Holy shit in a mitt, things are getting complicated. But oh so very, very awesome. A lot of people didn't like the changing art styles of Dead Space Aftermath, but I didn't mind it too much. There's only 1 or 2 of the art styles I didn't care for that much. But story-wise, I think it's a fantastic film and definitely worth checking out, and absolutely a huge, important part of the Dead Space 2 story. Severed, some people didn't like because they didn't like the fates of the characters from Extraction. They liked it being left more kind of ambiguous as it was at the end of Extraction, but whatever. Take it or leave it, it's all part of the official story, whether you like it or not. Alrighty, so as with the Dead Space 1 Disambiguation, I will put the master list of stuff in the description below so you can have a quick and easy reference to make sure you get everything. Alrighty, that is it from me to you for now. Next time we will take a look at Dead Space 3 and all the tie-ins. Dead Space 3 actually holds the record of having the least tie-ins of all of them, so it's probably going to be a much shorter video. Alrighty, we'll see you then. Until then, thanks for watching, and sayonara. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of my Dead Space Disambiguation videos. Last time we took a look at Dead Space, the original, and all the related tie-ins, and what order you should watch them, play them, listen to them. Well, I guess you'd be listening to them as your... Fuck off.